Welcome to the OxIgnite Podcast hosted by Yusuf, Raza, and Michael Hutson, two entrepreneurial MBA students at the University of Oxford. Together, we navigate the dynamic journeys of Oxford-linked founders, venture capitalists, and trailblazing innovators. Our mission, to fuel the fire in Oxford's next generation of boundary-pushing changemakers. Our sixth episode features Gabriel Levie, the co-founder of Wequity, an innovative startup offering AI-driven solutions for ESG compliance. Discover how Wequity is transforming the rapidly evolving ESG reporting space, helping companies navigate complex regulatory requirements worldwide. From carbon emissions to labor conditions, explore the intricacies of sustainability reporting and how Wequity's innovative platform streamlines data collection, empowering organizations to make informed decisions. Dive into the challenges faced by investors and companies in analyzing ESG data, and learn about Wequity's vision for the future, integrating AI to automate workflows and offer valuable insights for more effective actions. Get ready, get set, get OxIgnited.
Hello and welcome to OxIgnite. My guest today is Gabriel Levie from Wequity. Wequity allows organizations to navigate ESG compliance with ease by providing AI-driven solutions for finance professionals and corporate risk monitoring and compliance. Hi, Gabriel. Welcome to the OxIgnite podcast, video interviews, wide range of things that this is coming.
Hi, Yusuf. Very nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because you are operating in a space which is very hot right now.
It's
And
moving. That's right.
I think that's where I'd like to start this conversation by is, could you talk about some of these movements that have been happening in the ESG reporting space?
For sure. Well, ultimately it's a space that's driven by a number of stakeholders, right? So at the end of the day, what forces companies to report and to analyze things are really the regulators. So you see around the world, regulators are starting to force companies from certain size to analyze their ESG, impact and things they do on those topics and report on those topics. And so you see that in Europe happening massively with the corporate sustainability reporting directive, the CSRD. They have a similar regulation for the financial world in Europe, which is called the SFDR. The SEC in the US is starting to move on those topics. And a number of regulations around the world are moving on this topic. Ultimately, as well, if you think about it, these regulations come from consumer demand, and citizen demand, people who want action on climate topics. And so those are really the ones that are driving the way forward and pushing for those things to move. And then, different people in the ecosystem who need to then comply and move on those topics, which are the financial, the investors, the banks, the companies themselves. And bit by bit, people are positioning themselves and hopefully moving forward in the right direction.
So if we just talk about how rapidly this change has been happening, I'm not an expert in this space, but to me, it seems that changes are happening very rapidly, right? Could you talk about some of these regulations that have come up recently that is making ESG reporting a priority for companies?
Yeah, for sure. So, I can always only speak about what I know, and which is, what's happening here in Europe. I wouldn't be able to speak about what's going on in other parts. I think it's rapidly today. I think it's still way too slow if you look at what's going on with the planet and how long people have been speaking about, those topics and the real need to move forward. Also, let's not forget that it's not because you report that you're actually making a change, right? I can speak about things that I do, or I can set up a full team to make a very nice report. It doesn't mean that I'm actually making a change in my strategy, my processes, in my objectives, and my targets. And so really shouldn't conflate the need for reporting, but I think it's necessary because you can't, improve what you can't measure. And if you look at what's been changing in Europe, the main one that, that started a few years ago is the EU taxonomy, which has started regulating and standardizing basically the language with which a number of companies have to report on their environmental activities. And then now, bit by bit, this is starting to be enlarged. This was complemented with the SFDR regulation in Europe, and now with the CSRD in Europe, which replaces a previous one, which was much more vague, which was the NFRD. A number of acronyms that make life complicated. But basically, I think estimates say that within a couple of years, 50,000 companies in Europe will start to have to report with the CSRD. And then bit by bit, the eligibility criteria will start getting wider so that smaller companies will have to start, reporting on those topics as well. And then the final regulation, which we haven't mentioned and which is upcoming, I think, pretty soon, is what's called the CS Triple D, which is really talking about supplier due diligence and forcing companies to start engaging with their suppliers and making sure that in their value chain, a number of risks and a number of issues are being looked at and improved.
And just so we're on the same page, this is not just environmental issues, right? When you talk about sustainability, there are other issues beyond environmental causes as well. Could you
That's right.
just talk about some of those? What buckets are those?
Yeah, so I mean, if you take it, the large ones, you have the environmental topics, you have the social topics and the governance topics. I think governance has always been important for accounting purposes, for investors, just in general, because it's good management. Social topics can go very wide, talking about labor conditions, talking about human rights, talking about diversity and inclusion, which get included as well. And then even within environment, it's still hugely broad, right? Like you have the very narrow carbon emissions and GHG emissions, but then you can go a bit wider and start looking at other environmental issues such as, energy consumption, water usage. And now a big topic that's starting to get moved is biodiversity. What's going on in biodiversity? How are your activities affecting the biodiversity around you, around your supply chain, around your transport and logistics? And so it's hugely complex and very far from being a black and white world. So it's very important to, prioritize what are actually the urgent and important topics that we need to look at and move corporates into the right direction. But for sure, it's very wide.
It sounds like a very complex thing to track, We'll get more into how Wequity addresses this. But before that, could you just share how people are currently doing this or currently planning on doing this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, companies which we meet and even investors which we meet are at very varied stages of maturity. If you look at the investors in financial institutions, asset managers, they have typically large ESG data providers that aggregate data, that standardize, that have a methodology. Problem is that methodology is not always super clear. There are quite a number of divergences. It's not always up to date. Which data is, the coverage is also limiting. So, asset managers and investors have to start playing with what they got. And the problem is also that they rely, for a number of things, they rely on what corporates say about themselves, which is often, coming out with a delay and also limited by the corporate's perspective on what they do. And so they're trying to, expand and use a variety of different data sources to improve their decision. First, before they invest, can a company be included within their investment universe? And then secondly, once they've invested. And once they've invested, then they need to start looking at, okay, what do we do? Do we sell? Do we buy? Do we engage with the company? Do we start voting in resolutions to start actually making a difference on climate paths and targets that company needs to follow? And if you look at the corporates who need to start reporting on this, a lot of it today is still very manual. It's an Excel going around and lots of Excel sheets with lots of rows, lots of columns going around the different corporates and being shared around and people trying to gather that data bit by bit in the most effective way possible. You're starting to see solutions that exist to centralize data provision and analysis. We still find that it's a very manual process, very rigid. And the problem is that there's a lot of data that's structured, nice, in ERP systems and internal documents, but a lot of data is still unstructured and comes from internal PDF documents, Word documents, Excel files. And so it's a very hard thing. Imagine you're a large corporate and you start reporting on a number of topics, analyzing your activities in a lot of ESG topics. It's a very complex question. And so bit by bit, we're seeing companies are starting to provide solutions, including ourselves, to automate, to improve those processes, make them simpler and, make lives easier. Because ultimately, the goal of those regulations is not just to get people to report, right? Like you don't want to add just work for consultants and companies like myself to support that business. The goal really is to make sure the companies are starting to look at their activities in a multidimensional sense, not just looking at the financial aspects, but also looking at everything they're actually having an impact on, and bit by bit taking that into account to set up clear and credible transition pathways.
So I'm going to seg into your personal motivations behind wanting to start Wequity. How did the idea come about as well?
Actually, interestingly, the idea started, or the exposure to this domain started when I was in Oxford, because I joined and supported a group called Positive Investment Oxford, and also, movements of students and organizations that led and supported the university in setting up an ESG strategy within the endowment fund. And that's when I realized the power of the financial world to actually make a difference, to contribute, and the importance of investors to engage on those topics. So when I came back to Belgium, I just reconnected actually with a childhood friend of mine, Frank, who's now my co-founder. And we both had really just a real will to start projects and launch solutions and wanted to have an impact on those topics. And then bit by bit, during the studies, we tried to, met loads of people in the topic, trying to understand what are the issues, what are the problems that people have. A lot of it often came to data, where there was no, how can we help improve sustainability of companies? And often people didn't even know what the data is. What data can we use to actually analyze companies? So these are the questions that really started triggering us, understanding that actually, there are lots of problems that to be solved in enabling companies to assess themselves, but also enabling investors to assess companies. And so that bit by bit, when we started meeting people, understanding what the needs are, the challenges, we then got to where we are today. And as an early stage startup, you pivot a few times, you build a product, and then you see where the client demand is, what's a scalable product that you can start, expanding. And then here we are.
What was the process of building, the early stages of building like for you? You went through one, or is it a couple of accelerator programs already?
We joined a few, indeed. One in Belgium, one in Paris, actually in France. I think they're helpful. They enable you to a bit structure, your objectives, your milestones. They give you a bit of mentoring, a network, of course, some perks as well. One of them gave us a free office for a year, which is nice when you have an early stage startup. You have a number of costs that you want to minimize. So those were helpful. I think the process for us really was, and the key element still today really is to ship the product as quickly as possible, building it in the leanest way possible, and getting feedback as quickly as possible, and making a product that people really want, and that makes them more productive, that fills their needs, that makes them, stay on the product because it's actually really helping them do their job. And that's really the key thing that we're trying to keep up with, and that we're trying to build as much as possible, is working on that. So the first solutions and the first versions, really immediately, actually, my co-founder is just a genius. He started building it in no-code tools. Both of us. The funny thing is that both of us are not tech people. I studied philosophy and economics, and then he studied law, but he loves no-code and web development. And then he started building the first versions, and still now today, he's very much involved in the product development, and that's just very iterative and try to ship the product as fast as possible.
So I want you to talk about what Wequity does in the context of the stakeholders that you're serving. So basically, who are these users that you mentioned? Who could be potential users down the line as well? And where you are right now with your product, and where you see this going in the future as well?
Yeah, for sure. So actually, today, interestingly, we have two main elements that we cover. One is that we help portfolio managers specifically on a very particular element of ESG analysis, which is called the do no significant harm analysis and screening, and minimum safeguards, where we actually match data from companies' reports and what's ongoing happening in the news and social media to see whether companies are involved in specific events and controversies, to have a very frequent analysis of whether a company is breaching certain actually principles related to those topics. So that's one thing we do, because often today it's a very static way of approaching it. People rely on a yearly analysis that's done by a few large ESG data providers, but actually you can't just rely on what a company says and waiting for a year before making sure that a company actually aligns with a certain of those criteria is just pretty problematic. So that's one thing we do with a data feed that can be enablable and an interface to make it really live and easy monitoring. The second thing we do is really much more focused to actually private equity players and corporates, where we help them do the ESG reporting by just automating the whole data collection process. So what we enable them here is to, once they've understood which KPIs they need to report on, is to upload all the documents and the internal documents, PDFs, Excels, CSVs, whatever, and enable them to immediately pre-fill actually their ESG report and ESG questions. And so they can have two main use cases here. Is either the regulator asks them to make a report, and then it's very clear, it's quite standardized, or actually more and more their stakeholders are asking them a number of questions. It can be their investors or it can be their clients. And so here today, it's still very hard to gather all that data across the board. And so to facilitate that, automate it, makes it just much easier, makes them save a lot of time.
And what's your future plan with where the product goes?
I mean, the main vision that's underlying everything we do is how can we integrate AI as much as possible to automate and facilitate the workflows of our clients, which data sources are most helpful, which workflows and data points need to be gathered as quickly as possible in the most automated way possible, and what are the jobs that the clients need to do. There's a regulatory compliance job. The regulations are evolving, so the product will follow those regulations and make sure people can stay aligned and legible for those requirements. And then continuously with the interviews and feedback we get from the users, we'll make sure we keep iterating and aligning the roadmap with the common needs in general. And so bit by bit, what we see is that, there are some really cool things happening is large language models enable you to really automate a lot of data extraction and reporting and analysis. We're seeing with the most increasing availability of data, there's a lot of benchmarking that's going to be enabled and possible. And so there are cool avenues that are coming up that we're really excited about.
And have there been any particular, feature requests or certain topics that clients are talking to you about increasingly?
Yeah, for sure. So on the portfolio management side, we're seeing a need to have a more frequent and high-speed analysis done of companies, especially on a large coverage. Typically, that's the problem, is that data providers cover large caps. But when you start getting into small mid-cap companies or emerging markets, there's fewer data points. So that's something that often really comes up. And then on the other side, for corporates, there's a whole question of, how the hell do I need to start reporting on all of those elements? And so people start speaking about forming and building data lakes, centralizing data points, having actually a real-time data repository that enables reporting for a variety of different stakeholders in different formats. And so you're seeing it's getting much more dynamic in a way, instead of being static or manual processes.
Just continuing on that last point that you made, right? What are some of the challenges that you've faced so far with selling, not selling the Wequity product, but just increasing the awareness of why people should be thinking about a product such as Wequity? Because educating a market is not very easy, right?
It's very hard. It's a very good question. There are a number of challenges you see. One is the question of, okay, how urgent is this problem? And do people already aware of this problem today, or is it just coming tomorrow? And, are we actually solving a problem that's already there today, or are we just maybe anticipating something that might be coming up later down the line? That's a question. And so here there's always a question of understanding the regulations, what their timelines are, to what extent people are eligible, what their own strategies are and problems are. And there's a question of credibility as well. When you're a small player and you're starting to help large financial institutions, you need to start building track records and partnerships to expand very quickly. And that's something that we're doing more and more, is to start partnering with players, consulting firms, law firms, with whom we can then start, expanding, raising awareness on those topics that they can actually serve their clients using our solutions. Because then you start multiplying the effect and broadening your added value and the fact that people are aware of what you do.
Have there been any other challenges apart from the awareness aspect of it as well?
On just for a startup?
Yeah, I mean, just your journey building Wequity so far.
I think it's full of challenges. I would even say it's only challenges. And the question is, how fast, how can you prioritize and how fast are you able to overcome them? And challenges that keep arising constantly. So, you have challenges related to your product, the stability of your product. You have challenges related to, the sales cycle, the length of the sales cycle. You have challenges related to talent, finding the right team, finding the right people, making sure that you have the right motivation, skills, and grit in the team. That's very hard. So you have challenges constantly, and these things are just going to keep going, I think, and probably just get more difficult and more difficult as we grow.
So on the prioritization front, do you have a personal framework for prioritization?
Well, one tool we use, which is very helpful, and I would definitely encourage any early stage founders to use it, it's called Cycle app. It came out of the Hexa startup studio, and we know the founder quite well and the team. And they've been really helpful in order to just centralize feedback from prospects, clients, interviews, and helping us to prioritize the needs, the personas, and then the product roadmap. And now we're, bit by bit using that as well to automate and prioritize what we build in the roadmap. And I think that's been very, very helpful. And it's a question of, there's no secret sauce when you're really early stage like us. There's no just secret formula you can use. It's a question of understanding, quantifying the importance of the need and the problem that you're solving, quantifying the number of people that actually you've spoken to who've confirmed that problem, and then starting to build as quickly as possible a view of what the solution could look like and testing it out.
What excites you the most in the near to mid future about Wequity?
I think the most exciting thing is building something that people love and that is going to help them move the needle on ESG topics. And I think bit by bit, as we can start doing that and get integrated and support more and more clients, that's something I'm really excited about.
And if you don't mind sharing, you mentioned you were excited about the use of AI and LLMs, right? What are some of the, let's go more towards the crazy end of the spectrum, right? What are some of the more creative ideas that you've had around the use of LLMs and ESG related issues?
Well, the crazy thing with what you can do today is that you can really gather a huge volume of structured and unstructured data and make sense of it, and then use it to actually build your roadmap, build your strategy, know where you're at, and enable humans to focus on what matters, what excites them, instead of doing manual tasks. So it's a very vague and generic answer, but once you start getting into ESG, when you look at all the different reporting requirements or all the different things that people need to work on, you can start really gathering data, large volumes of data to understand where a company is, what they're doing, what its impact is, and how it can improve. So those things are just really exciting. I wouldn't rely on the AI to actually make the change, right? At the end of the day, companies need to make the change themselves, need to have realistic and credible transition pathways where they reduce their emissions and they improve what they do on those topics and labor conditions and a number of other things. But what you can do is enable companies to just, focus on what matters and building their strategy in a positive way and using AI to just automate a number of these things so that this compliance thing of the question of reporting and measuring is not used basically as an excuse to say, oh, it's going to be too hard. We don't know where the data is. We don't know how to measure. Well, actually, no, today's solutions are there to facilitate all of this so that you can focus on your business and on actually setting up your strategy on those ESG topics and implementing it and being ambitious about these things because we need to be ambitious.
On the action piece of things, right? In your ideal scenario, as Wequity grows, what do you think is more likely to happen? That you start working with more and more clients, hopefully, right? But then the clients themselves have the have people internally who can take action, who know how to take action based on the data that's being generated. That's one scenario. You've got one in which, as Wequity grows, along with the product, you yourself start, like a service or advisory practice on top of that. Or you've got the third scenario where you partner with, like large or boutique consulting firms who use Wequity for the consulting purposes. Which
Or you
direction
have
did?
all
Sorry.
three scenarios at the same time, right?
Yeah, but again,
Um,
as a startup, there's only so much you can focus on, right?
that's true. That's true. Well, for us, short term, there's no objective to do advisory ourselves.
All right.
So we partner with people who do this very well, with a credibility and a track record to do this. That's for sure. I think a number of companies want to keep that expertise and strategy in-house. And I think that part of it makes sense because you know your business best and you know what your long-term strategy is going to be and you know how to implement it. You know the right stakeholders. But then otherwise, I think a lot of companies as well are going to use consultants bit by bit to start implementing once to make sense of the data, to make targets, to set action plans, to really set a roadmap as well to improve. So it's going to really depend on the case by case. But I know that for us in the short term, we're not going to do advisory ourselves.
All right. So mainly a product-driven company.
For sure. That being said, your product can give you advice, right? Once you're actually, if the product is actually, being used by a significant number of people, you can start matching patterns, right? Of like per industry, what are action plans and what are actions that are taken that are actually the most effective to reduce emissions, for example, or to do a number of things. That's where you can start gathering insights on transition pathways of different companies and realistic projects and ways to do this. And you can actually productize your advice in a way.
Yeah, this is pretty interesting, right? So you can basically build a product in a way that people can basically, you've got some people giving advice on the system, and then you can use that data which you collect across many companies to come up with some prescriptive analytics on that front. Yeah, very interesting. So
For sure.
So if I rewind the clock back to your years at Oxford, you mentioned how that helped you kind of focus more on the sustainability aspect, how it increased your exposure to the ESG space. How did your time at Oxford help shape you as a leader, as an entrepreneur?
Oof. Tough question. Because in Oxford, at least when I was there in undergrads, the university itself is mostly focused on making you think and build arguments and analyze topics and understand content. But next to that, although that's very important, to be able to quickly analyze any situation and think about it and structure next steps and arguments, I think that's definitely essential in the actual degree. Next to that, I think I joined a number of initiatives, particularly one person called Adam Bacon, who launched a startup at the time with his partner, and which really was focused actually a food tech company. And I was there volunteer actually for a year, trying to help him grow the company, sell the products. And then, so that was just really interesting to just get into it and realize that anybody can just start a company and you can try and see what happens and get out there and get feedback and try to grow it. Unfortunately, this company didn't work out for him, but I know he launched another one called Fibris, and now he's in London in the health tech space, and I think that's going pretty well. So it's just very exciting to meet people who you can look up to and who can give you advice and actually show you that it's possible, and then give you the confidence to give it a try. And then, of course, very privileged to be around in Oxford, surrounded by quite a lot of bright people who have initiatives, a number of organizations that's stimulating these things, and then still privileged and very lucky to have had the chance to get it started when I left.
All right. Last question for today. As a co-founder at a startup, at the early stages, it can be pretty stressful at times. What's your approach towards managing stress? Have you found any particular activities that help you with, like holistically all aspects of wellness?
It's an amazing question and super important question. And I think even very recently, VC fund Boulderton started taking this very seriously. You can look on their website. They have a whole wellness and founder wellness program with a number of insights, resources that they recommend, which is very helpful. I had a look at it actually last week. Personally, for me, there are a number of key things. It's sleep. It's exercise very regularly. It's emotional well-being. So there's a really cool app actually that's called Mood Meter, developed by Yale University, that enables you to check in with your own mood on a very regular basis and develop the right language to understand your own emotions and how you react to it. And then, the social connections. So being able to be open with your co-founder, if you have one, speaking about it, getting feedback, be honest about how you feel. And then also just speak with other people who are totally not involved, with whom you can just open up with and share ups and downs, because it's a real roller coaster. And I think being aware of this well-being aspect, I think, is essential, because actually, it's a long run game, even though it's very intense. So, if you burn tomorrow because of mental health, it's really such a shame, because then the whole thing is just going to go down the drain. So it's such an important topic, but it's a very difficult topic.
That's a lot of really good advice on that front. Well, Levie, this has been a very, very insightful conversation. I personally have got to learn quite a lot through this short interview. Thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Enjoyed the discussion. Enabled me to get another perspective on what we do, and hope to connect. Really found it insightful, and your questions were really interesting. So have a great end of your day.
Thank you for tuning into OxIgnite. Please reach out to Yusuf, Raza, or Michael Hutson on LinkedIn if you are an entrepreneur with ties to Oxford and want to create more awareness about your venture, or if you are an investor interested in investing in Oxford-linked startups, or if you are a brand that wants to sponsor an episode of the OxIgnite podcast. If you like this podcast, please help us spread the word to your network. We would also welcome any donations to help us scale this podcast. You can donate at buymeacoffee.com/OxIgnite, OXIGNITE.